your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition.
I'm Naveen Day. Thanks for joining us. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government will not table a budget when Parliament returns in the coming weeks. Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne says the Liberals instead plan to put forward a fall economic statement, but he didn't give a clear timeline for the introduction of the government's latest fiscal plan.
The first thing you do is the first step of this government is a middle-class tax cut. That's the first thing. You start with that. Then you say, well, you need to have a throne speech to say what are the priorities of the government. And once you've done that, then you do an economic statement, which is going to be the fall economic statement. So this is the logical piece.
Year at this point, right?
Well,
we're just going to go forward without a budget.
Fall is fall, you know. I could not be clearer than that. Fall is fall.
Now, to chime in on this is the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, who is shaking his head in disbelief. Franco Terrazzano says failing to even present a budget is a huge crack in Prime Minister Mark Carney's credibility. He says Carney owes Canadians a budget.
Failing to produce a budget is a huge crack in Carney's credibility, right? Like, you can't have credibility on the finances if you can't even bother to put together a budget. And, you know, Canadians have many reasons to be worried about our national finances, right? The federal government doubled the debt in less than a decade. Interest charges on the debt are blowing a $1 billion hole in the budget every single week. So Canadians have every reason to be worried about the eroding state of our national finances. And the Carney government is essentially shrugging off those concerns.
Prime Minister Mark Carney conducted a major cabinet shakeup on Tuesday. Carney has moved several key players involved in Canada-U.S. relations into new positions and promoted some newly elected MPs to the front bench. Dominic LeBlanc will spearhead trade between Canada and the States in the wake of tariffs and the threats of annexation. Anita Anand is the new Foreign Affairs Minister, and former Justice Minister Gary Anandasangri takes over public safety. Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly will take on the complex industry portfolio. Carney dropped Bill Blair from cabinet and named David McGuinty to the role of Defense Minister. His cabinet is made up of 28 full ministers and 10 secretaries of state. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre says Carney's cabinet certainly has a lot of familiar names from the Trudeau era.
Then there's Joly, LeBlanc, Haidu, Anand. Anand was the president of the Treasury Board, during which time the bureaucracy and the consultant bills blew out of control. In all, 14 Trudeau ministers are now in Carney's cabinet. It's more of the same when Canada needs real change. Even the new additions are problematic. Gregor Robertson was the mayor of Vancouver, who pushed for total legalization of hard drugs, distribution of tax-funded opioids. During his time there was a 600% increase in overdoses. Now he's the housing minister. Well, what's his record on housing? Well, he increased housing taxes in Vancouver by 141%, and the result was that housing costs went up by 149%, more than doubling the costs and giving Vancouver, his city, the most expensive housing prices in all of North America. Now, Mr. Carney puts this gentleman in charge of housing. If this is the new blood that Mr. Carney is bringing into the cabinet, then sadly for Canadians, nothing is going to change, and the role of the Conservative Party will be more important than ever.
Poilievre says if his party can make gains for the 8 million Canadians who voted for them, they will do that without apology. And according to Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, many of the cabinet positions have been filled by unknown MPs. Here's part of his interview with BCN's Jeanette Rocher.
24 new people are in cabinet. I just want people to let that sink in. This is massive. He dropped 11 people, and so we're with secretaries of state and full cabinet ministers. We're just under 40, but 24 new people. I'm still Googling some of them to figure out who they are and why they're in cabinet, and do they have any of the qualifications. So people like Bill Blair were dropped, and then people that you've never heard of are now in charge of major portfolios. We can get into that in a moment, but this is a major shakeup, and clearly a sign that Mark Carney wanted to send the message that this is not the same cast of characters. There are some, but this is not the same cast of characters that ran the Trudeau government.
A middle-class tax cut was one of Prime Minister Mark Carney's first orders of business after he and his new cabinet met for the first time on Wednesday. If passed by Parliament, the tax cut will come into effect by July 1st. Carney is promising to lower the personal income tax rate for some Canadians by 1%, which he says will save some families up to $840 a year. During his first meeting with his new government, several new committees were also formed, including a Priorities Planning and Strategy Committee chaired by Carney and a new Build Canada Committee focused on strengthening Canada's economy. One thing missing from Mark Carney's new cabinet is someone representing the interests of disabled Canadians. And disability advocates say that whole sidelines millions of people during what the PM promises will be a time of growth and rebuilding.
Not having that is absolutely a concern for us. You know, a big issue for the disability community right now is the Canada Disability Benefit. It's supposed to roll out July 1st. If we look at the last fall economic statement, you know, there's a lot of commitments in there that we need to see moved on. Making the Canada Disability Benefit tax exempt. That's legislation has got to get through. That will make a huge difference for the amount of money people with disabilities actually get to keep out of this benefit, right? There are lots of priorities in the disability community around employment, around housing, around all kinds of things, but that's the most imminent one.
The rallying cry of elbows up is seeing Canadians' U.S. trips go way down. Stats Canada says preliminary April figures show return U.S. trips by land and air have declined for the fourth consecutive month. Canadians have canceled their U.S. trips in protest of U.S. tariffs, and President Donald Trump repeated 51st state comments about annexing Canada. Return trips by air fell nearly 20%, while land border trips dropped by more than 35% for the same time a year earlier. The spring session of the Alberta legislature wrapped up Wednesday night, and not surprisingly, United Conservative members are calling it a success. Government House Leader Joseph Scow says the government made good on its promised tax cut in Budget 2025, and it passed 19 bills, but the government's also faced attacks from the NDP over the so-called corrupt care scandal. The NDP continues to demand a public inquiry into allegations of wrongdoing involving the firing of a former CEO of Alberta Health Services and bloated contracts going to friends of the UCP. Scow was asked about the often heated debate during the session and lack of decorum.
It is one thing to argue and disagree and be frustrated with policy. That's the nature of the business. But when we devolve into petty personal attacks and what seems like unprofessional behavior, language that creates disorder within the chamber, I'm going to rise in a point of order, particularly when it's a personal attack against a minister who is putting his or herself out every day on behalf of the province, consulting, looking at ways to make the province better. I also think it's quite disappointing the way that the members in the NDP caucus have attacked the Premier, both in the chamber and outside the chamber in press conferences. I think it's quite deplorable.
But opposition leader Christina Gray fired back Thursday, accusing UCP members of the same kind of behavior. As for the spring session, Gray says instead of addressing issues like the rising cost of living or the crisis in healthcare, the UCP pushed through anti-democratic legislation, dodged accountability, covered up corruption, and stifled debate. Gray says they're deeply concerned about Bill 54, the Election Statutes Amendment Act.
Not only have First Nations demanded that it be fully repealed because of the attack on their treaty rights and obligations, but also the Chief Electoral Officer and the former Elections Commissioner both wrote letters outlining how it would undermine people's ability to engage in elections, how it would undermine access, how it would undermine investigations. And the majority of the complaints that have been raised and levied against Bill 54 were not resolved, addressed in any way. And Bill 54 received, I believe it was less than 5 hours of debate across less than 2 weeks because it was introduced so late in the session. It's bad legislation.
And with Bill 54, she strips away your democratic voting rights. She strips away your ability to vote if your house was destroyed in a fire. She strips away the rights of students to be able to vote when they're away at school in their home constituencies. And fundamental voting rights are sacred as far as I'm concerned. She also is playing fast and loose with Indigenous rights. So today, I believe, I wasn't there, but I believe the Onion Lake First Nation today reaffirmed their commitment to fighting the Alberta Sovereignty Act in court. We've always known the Alberta Sovereignty Act is blatantly unconstitutional. And I hope that the courts will find that soon. Perhaps the Onion Lake case will be the one that allows them to do that.
Wednesday night, the UCP government's pushed through more changes to Bill 54. The government already made changes to the act to make it easier for citizens to gather signatures to force a referendum. First Nations and Indigenous groups have said any move to separate from Canada would violate treaty rights. The act now includes a clause stating that nothing in a referendum under the act is to deviate from existing treaty rights. In a statement, Justice Minister Mickey Amery says Alberta's government will always recognize, protect, and honor treaty rights as recognized by Section 35 of the Constitution. The government has also introduced an amendment that says it will preserve the status quo and disallow mail-in ballots for constitutional referendums, which is currently the law. A group calling for 2 UCP cabinet ministers to resign loaded what they call the People Bus in Edmonton and Calgary Tuesday, with supporters to be taken to Health Minister Adriana Lagrange's office in Red Deer. The group called Public Interest Alberta is canvassing Lagrange's riding and calling for her to resign, saying it's prompted by the situations in hospitals and alleged corruption scandals at Alberta Health. Justice Minister Mickey Amery is also facing backlash. The opposition NDP says he has personal ties to people at the center of the UCP's so-called corrupt care scandal, and he failed to disclose the conflict of interest. Premier Daniel Smith is denying the claims. 90% of the government of Alberta's unionized workers have voted in favor of strike action. This was the big news Tuesday from the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees, who held a news conference in Edmonton to announce the results of this historic strike vote by the majority of their 23,000 members who work for the province. This includes workers like nurses, ACERT officers, counselors, probation officers, sheriffs, peace officers, jail guards, occupational health and safety investigators, conservation officers, fish and wildlife scientists, workers with vulnerable Albertans, and the list goes on and on. Union President Guy Smith says when recent negotiations with the provincial government hit an impasse, they felt they had no choice but to take a strike vote.
This was an historic vote, the first in our 106-year history as a union. And the results are compelling. 80% of our members participated in the vote, and 90.1% of them voted yes in favor of taking strike action. However, ultimately, it is our goal, and it is always our goal, to get a deal at the table. We do not want to have to use the clear strike mandate we have received, but we will if necessary. And our members can take confidence in knowing that we are fully ready and prepared to support them in the event of a strike. But in the meantime, we now have the full backing and support of the members, and we call upon the government to come back to the table and negotiate seriously towards a successful conclusion.
Smith says the majority of the bargaining was to do with salary increases. AUPE served official notice of strike vote back on April 16th when the bargaining with the assistance of a mediator did not produce a satisfactory agreement. Guy Smith says he still believes a deal is achievable. More than enough signatures have been acquired to hold a referendum for Alberta to separate. To talk more about this is Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson.
Okay, so Tyler, the Alberta Prosperity Project, so this is one of the groups pushing for a separation referendum. They revealed the question it wants to put to Alberta voters this year. And Tyler, I also understand that they've received more than the required number of signatures. I think they're needing 177,000 to trigger a referendum, and I think at last count they were at 225,000. So how does this compare to Quebec's referendum?
Well, there's a couple points here. The first one, the question. In 1995, if people remember, the Quebec question was really, really complicated and long and wordy, and there was some sense from the sovereigntists at the end of that process that maybe they kind of messed that up by making the question too convoluted, or they'd been, had the rug pulled out from under them. So in this case, the question that the Alberta Prosperity Project wants to put forward is really quite simple. It's, do you agree that Alberta shall become an independent country and cease to be a province of Canada? So really straightforward, really clear. And of course, after the Quebec 1995 referendum, there was a reference case to the Supreme Court of Canada on how all of this would happen. And the Clarity Act was passed that sets out a bunch of rules basically on how a secession referendum would happen and what would happen if that won. And one of those things that the Clarity Act sets out is the requirement of having a very, very clear question. So that's presumably what they're trying to do here with the straightforwardness of that question. The signature side of things is a little bit more complicated. It is true that once the changes to the Citizen Initiative Act come into effect, that it will only be 10% of people who voted in the last provincial election. So it was about just shy of 1.8 million people voted in the 2023 election. So 10% of that, about, as you say, 177,000 signatures. The old threshold was quite a bit higher than that. And the Alberta Prosperity Project has also said that they're sort of aiming for a higher bar than that bare minimum before they push this thing forward. The argument being that they don't just want to have a referendum, they want to have one and then win it.
I think they're looking at this fall already, so interesting. Okay, so meanwhile, Alberta Premier Smith, she's certainly declined to be critical of these types of groups, and apparently there are a few reasons for that. So what are they, Tyler?
Yeah, so my impression of it is a couple things. The first is that Alberta's conservative movement, Alberta's right wing, is sort of always at risk of coming apart at the seams. And the United Conservative Party is sort of cobbled together from different components of the conservative movement in this province. So if there's a significant stream of conservatives who believe that Alberta should separate, the premier risks, having another party form on her right flank, and that causes, electoral problems down the road, obviously. So I think that's part of it. The second part of it is that if you look at the polling, there's quite a distinct partisan divide on people who are really, really mad about Alberta's place within Confederation and who are sympathetic to separation. And about 2/3 of the people who voted for the United Conservatives in the last election say that they would vote for separation from Canada. So Danielle Smith is essentially leading a party that has a lot of people who are either hard separatists or sympathetic in some fashion. So she, again, jeopardizes her leadership and the cohesiveness of her party if she was to come out really, really strongly and say that. And there was a really, really good indication of sort of the strange position she's in at the moment this week. A reporter asked her what she would say about the possibility that even talking about separation is going to make Alberta seem like a risky investment climate, and that could have economic consequences. And she very much declined to sort of agree with that, and just said, this is a question that ought to be put to the people who are pushing for this, which is really, really notable because, of course, if she was going to be making an argument against separation without criticizing the people behind it, that might be one of the arguments that she would choose to make. She might choose to say, this is a delicate economic time for Alberta. To have this discussion now is really, really risky. But she didn't. So I think that's probably what's going on in terms of the rationale for how she is approaching this issue.
A law firm recently won a significant court ruling related to COVID vaccinations. The plaintiff, Young Yi, sued her former employer, WestJet Airlines, and won. She was terminated for not taking the COVID vaccine, even though she was working from home. According to her lawyer, James Kitchen of Kitchen Wells LPP, the case sets a precedent as it's the first court ruling of its kind in the country.
she asks WestJet for an accommodation, which the law says WestJet pretty much has to give unless they have a really good reason not to, called undue hardship, okay? And so what WestJet did, like, you know, hundreds of employers did to tens of thousands of employees all across the country, is they said, we don't think you've triggered the legal requirement on our end to accommodate you, so we're not going to accommodate you, okay? And because of that, she was fired, right? Because at that point, WestJet said, well, you didn't comply with the policy, you didn't take the shot, you're fired. This happened all across the country. I've had dozens and dozens of cases like this, but this is the first one that I've got a decision from a court on. And what the court said was, one, she should have been accommodated, and had she been accommodated, she wouldn't have been fired, so terminating her for cause was unlawful because you terminated her only as a result of discriminating against her, right? This is what the court said to WestJet. In addition to that, it was still unlawful to terminate this woman for cause for not taking the shot because she was working from home and could have continued to work from home. And obviously at that point, it's not about safety. It's about ideology or control or power or whatever the heck it was. And so the court said, look, for both of these reasons, it was unlawful to terminate her with cause, and now you owe her the damages, which turned out in this case to be about $68,000, I think. So that's what WestJet has to pay her for the fact that they unlawfully terminated her for not taking the shot. This is the first court ruling on this in the country.
Fire crews in Manitoba battling deadly out-of-control wildfires will soon be getting help from Alberta. The province says it's sending 2 wildland firefighting crews and support staff to Manitoba in the coming days. A wildfire in the eastern part of Manitoba has killed 2 people who officials identified as Richard and Sue Noel. Fires have also forced the province to declare a state of emergency in Whiteshell Provincial Park and prompted evacuations. At the time of this recording, 2 wildfires burning near a resort village in Saskatchewan could also lead to evacuations, and residents in Candle Lake are being told to plan to be ready in case of an evacuation, which could happen on short notice. The simple act of closing a door saved a house from burning to the ground, and some amazing stories from Lethbridge's Fire and Emergency Services, all up next. Lethbridge Fire and Emergency Services want to remind us that the simple act of closing a door can contain a fire. That's exactly what happened Monday afternoon in a house fire in South Lethbridge. Fire crews from 3 stations responded to the blaze in the 1800 block of 18th Street South at around 2 p.m. Chief Fire Marshal Troy Hicks with Lethbridge Fire and Emergency says they arrived to find light smoke coming from the 1-story family home. They were able to contain the fire to a bedroom on the main floor because the homeowners closed the bedroom door before leaving, which prevented the fire from spreading.
The fact of closing that door, the bedroom door being closed when the people evacuated, helped to just keep that fire isolated into the one room. Whether the people realize that or not, by them closing the door when they evacuated, it saved their home. It saved so much, minimized the damage that happened in their home. Now they have a room to repair and fix, not an entire house. The fire needs oxygen to continue to burn. And by closing a door, whether it's a bedroom door, basement door, kitchen door, whatever it is, you're helped to mitigate the amount of oxygen that can get there to feed the fire. So even if there's still a lot of fuel in that room to burn, if there's no oxygen, it's not going to burn. Also, another advantage of closing your door is it'll keep all the heat, smoke, flames, all damage in that room, prevents it from damaging the rest of the house. And it also shows us when the fire department respond, we now know where the fire situation is, where the area of origin is, the room of origin, and it's that much quicker to get in there and get the fire put out.
No injuries were reported, and damage is estimated between $50,000 and $75,000. The cause of the fire is under investigation. And speaking of emergency crews, they turned into Mother's Day heroes last Sunday when they were called to the scene of a Lethbridge eatery to rescue some trapped diners. In this next report, Sunday's incident turned out to be a memorable Mother's Day for some local patrons. It's almost like those fairy tale stories and movies where a maiden is trapped up in a tower waiting for her hero to rescue her. Almost. What unfolded at a Mother's Day lunch at the Water Tower Grill became a memorable story for 2 women with physical limitations after the restaurant's only elevator broke down.
Usually a Mother's Day is one of the busiest days for us for the whole year, and we had 200 customers in the lunchtime. So they all came in between 11:15 to 12, and probably we use a lot of flights up and down. Elevator sends it hot. temperature, and it started shut down.
With no timeline when the elevator would be fixed, patrons were required to go up and down the stairwell, which consists of 150 steps. 911 was then dispatched to assist two patrons who had physical limitations.
Initially, two trucks from this station, the downtown station, were dispatched. We have an aerial unit called our tower, which along with our rescue truck, we went to the scene to kind of assess things and see what we needed to be able to assist these people out of that building. In the process, we put our aerial device up and looked at the reach for that, as well as we accessed the upstairs of the restaurant and made access with the patients and talked to them and figured out what their physical limitations were and what we were looking at in terms of getting them out, and then came up with a game plan from there.
Usage of the aerial device was ruled out to rescue the two damsels in distress. However, it was used in a tertiary role to shuttle equipment up and down to carry out the rescue mission. A special wheelchair was deployed that allows rescue crews to transport individuals from tight spaces and through stairways. And just like the fairy tales, once they were rescued from the tower, the individuals went on to live happily ever after. For Bridge City News, I'm Naveen Day. A family has anonymously donated $1 million towards the Bringing Hearts Home campaign. The campaign's goal is to raise $30 million over 30 months to establish the proposed Cardiac Center of Excellence at two Southern Alberta regional hospitals in Lethbridge and Medicine Hat. Crystal Elliott, CEO of Chinook Regional Hospital Foundation, says she was astounded by the large donation.
One of the things that I've learned since we commenced this campaign in August, September of 2024, is that people are good. I have had the opportunity to experience the best in people and how much Southern Albertans want to contribute to this campaign. It matters to each and every one of us and those that we love. And people are demonstrating that. The donations are coming in. The momentum is real. We are building a movement.
Now, this donation is the first $1 million donation to be announced so far, and Elliott says they are on track to reach their $30 million goal. The campaign began in September 2024 and will run until February 2027. Coming up after the break, we chat with Kimberly Hurst and Sergeant Vince Bacon about Alberta Citizens on Patrol and how this organization is helping create safer communities. And if you're watching us online, that full interview is available on our YouTube channel.